Let us start. Very good evening to all of you. Very warm welcome to the ISID Research Seminar. It's a monthly seminar that we organize. So I'm very happy that we have today, we are going to discuss a very important aspect of global trade, that is the global value chain and India's position in global value chain in recent period. So in order to discuss this, we have a very distinguished presenter and extremely distinguished panelist of three. So we all know the global value chain is an important aspect of global trade in the realm of increasing globalization, because the value chain is now not confined to a particular location. It is distributed across many countries, and countries are eager to reap the benefit of value from these different stages. So compared to the traditional argument of trade, the specialization has moved from product to more specific task. So in order to explore these aspects, we have today Dr. Isha Chawla. She is a consultant at ISID, and also we have three distinguished panelists. I will briefly introduce them so that we can have a very smooth presentation followed by discussion. So Dr. Isha Chawla, she has done her PhD from Delhi School of Economics, and after that she has worked in various colleges of Delhi University, and she specializes in foreign direct investment, trade, global value chains, etc. And she is also a recipient of Exim Bank very prestigious award for PhD. And we have three distinguished panelists. One is first panelist is Dr. Bhushan Praveen Jangan. He is from IIT Jodhpur. He has done an extensive research in economics and international trade, and he holds PhD in economics from IIT Hyderabad. And he was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad, and also faculty at IIM, Bodh Gaya. And he is currently working at IIT Jodhpur. He has also done extensive work on global value chain. Our second panelist is Dr. Karishma Banga. She has completed her PhD in global value chain itself, and it's upgrading issues in the Indian economy. Her PhD is from University of Manchester. Her specialization lies in international trade, digitalization, and development. And Dr. Banga's research focuses on upgrading in global value chain, digitalization impact on labor markets, and digital trade negotiation, particularly in Africa and Asian economies. Then, last but not the least, we have Dr. Satyaki Roy. He is associate professor at ISID. He's done his PhD from University of Calcutta. His research spanned diverse areas such as industrial clusters, labor and employment, structural change in India, and political economy of informality. So in this presentation, I was thinking we will have, say, 20-25 minutes for the presentation for Isha, followed by, say, 5 to 7 minutes of panel discussion, and then we will have some question and answer. So without wasting much time, let us hear what Dr. Isha has to offer. So the floor is yours, Dr. Isha.
Thank you, Rajesh. Yeah, this is okay?
Yeah. Please do it in full screen mode.
Yeah.
Okay, your floor.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much all for joining. This is my first exercise in global value chains, because previously I have worked in outward FDI and I've been working using firm level data. So again, this is my first exercise using aggregate and sectoral level data. And the basic inspiration which came for this paper was that while going through Rashmi Banga's paper, there were some aspects which we wanted to know what their updated version would be. So from that exercise, that what is the current situation in case of global value chains, this exercise has come up. And when we got stuck at a certain stage using the trade and value added database, we had to move on to another database, which is the Asian Development database, Asian Development Bank database. So that is how the two databases have got combined here. So I think this slide heading is not visible, Rajesh. Am I right? Can you see the heading of the slide?
Visible introduction.
Yeah, okay, then you can see, right. So the traditional view of international trade is that each country produces goods and services that are exported as final products to consumers abroad. But today, 70% of trade involves global value chains that are internationally fragmented networks of production sharing, covering the full range of activities from design, production, marketing, distribution, and support to the final consumer, divided amongst multiple firms and workers across geographic spaces to bring a product from conception to end use and beyond. Services, raw materials, parts, and components thus cross borders often numerous times. And once they're incorporated into final products, they are shipped to consumers all across the world. So to give an example, a smartphone which is assembled in China might include graphic design elements from the US, computer code from France, silicon chips from Singapore, and precious metals from Bolivia. All countries involved retain some value and benefit from the export of the final product. So as Rajesh mentioned previously, that comparative advantage in the traditional theory was considered in terms of countries and sectors, but of late in the global value chain literature, more is aligned towards functional specialization or hyper specialization. So to give an example here, for instance, when we say that Philippines is specializing in the electronics value chain, then it basically means that Philippines is specializing in a certain task in the electronics value chain, which may move from electronic components to sub-assemblies and parts, other electronic and electrical components, and then to the final product. Now, the way in which the GVCs are structured could be in terms of spider-like structures in which multiple parts and components converge to an assembly plant that exports, for instance, Boeing's Dreamliner, or snake-like structures with value added created sequentially in a series of stages that can cross borders often multiple times, for instance, in the manufacture of a chip. The global value chain literature requires us to decompose gross exports into its value-added components by origin, that is by domestic and foreign, and the domestic value-added component and the foreign value-added components being the two components of gross exports. Domestic value-added can itself be decomposed into the one which is embodied either in final or intermediate goods or services directly consumed by the importing economy, contained in intermediate goods or services exported by a partner economy that re-exports them to third economies in downstream production stages, and that is embodied in other products. So this is known as the forward participation in GVCs. And definitionally, we would say that it is the domestic value added that is embodied in foreign exports as share of gross exports. And the third is in exported intermediates that are re-imported back to the home economy. And foreign value added by the value added origin country consists of value added of inputs, intermediates or tasks imported and embodied in the production of intermediate or final goods or services to be exported, and this constitutes the backward participation in GVCs. That is the foreign value added that is embodied as share of a country's gross exports. So total gross value added GVC participation is a sum of forward and backward participation, the denominator being gross exports. So both are additive. Now, when we look at the trends of gross exports, domestic and foreign value added content, we find that there has been a surge in gross exports, foreign value added, domestic value added since the 2000s, as we can see more perceptibly. But for the decline in 2009, there has again been a rise, and the peak was reached in 2012, 2013. Subsequently, there was a decline and then again a revival. But as we can see, again, this data, that is the trade and value added data, this is till 2018. And subsequently, for the remaining years, we will come to the ADB database. And when you look at the percentage shares of domestic value added and the foreign value added, domestic value added has been falling, and what is of importance here is, again, as has been mentioned in the literature, that a decline in the domestic value added component can be associated with a hollowing out effect, especially in the case of manufacturing, because it is domestic value added that contributes to GDP, employment, and the last figure, the bottom right figure, this shows the domestic value added in exports of intermediate exports as a percentage of total and manufactured exports. So here we find that in the literature, the domestic value added in exports of intermediate goods has been used by some scholars to look at the GVC participation of economies. But what we have done is that we have looked at the domestic value added in the exports which go to the third country in terms of looking at the GVC definition. That is, we have not used this indicator. Rather, we have looked at the domestic value added, which is embodied in foreign exports as share of a country's gross exports. Now, why do GVCs matter? We have seen there are various studies which have looked at the impact on employment, on total factor productivity. Though the impact on employment, the net employment gains are not coming out to be positive, as Karishma will herself be able to give more details. And in total factor productivity, Golder and Golder 2023 is a recent study which has used cluster analysis, and they have used exports, imports, and OFDI to identify a GVC firm. So for product sophistication also, participation in GVCs matter. And when we look at the impact on domestic value added, that is, what is the significance of the domestic value added, then there is a different view in the sense that Guha, Khasnobis et al., they say that stronger backward linkages in GVCs have a labor displacement effect, whereas stronger forward linkages in GVCs create employment opportunities. Whereas Veeramani and Dhar, they say that greater backward GVC participation, that is use of imported inputs to produce for exports, leads to higher absolute levels of gross exports, domestic value added, and employment. And Jangam and Rath, they have considered GVC participation, that is both forward and backward, and that is considered to enhance the domestic value added in exports. Now, when we look at the trends in India's forward, backward, and total GVC participation, we find that the backward participation has been rising in more recent years. And this backward participation, as we know, is because of the foreign value added content in gross exports, the intermediate inputs that are imported. And when we compare with other economies in the Asia Pacific region, we find that India's GVC participation is low in comparison with several Asia Pacific economies, yet the total GVC participation is comparable with that of China. So now this may come out as a revelation in the sense that not to those who are working in the GVC area, but when I started working for the first time, I found that India's GVC participation rate is coming out to be close to that of China, and I was not able to understand how that is so. Then you look at the various other indicators of GVC participation, then it becomes clear how China dominates over India in the GVC aspects. Then when we look at the, just a minute, when we look at the forward and the backward participation of economies, we have the 45-degree line, which is showing the forward and backward participation rates to be the same. So for 2000 and 2018, when we compare, we find that India had a more forward leaning in 2000, and by 2018, it had a backward leaning, whereas China moved the other way, and various economies like Japan and USA have a higher forward leaning in comparison with some economies like Malaysia, Singapore, Korea, Vietnam, that have a higher backward leaning. Now, some graphs I have presented just to show the dominance of China, because in recent literature, the China plus one consideration that India can be another destination for FDI and GVCs. But when we look at the data, it shows that India requires a lot of effort to come to that level. Because, for instance, when we look at the participation of OECD with non-OECD in the backward linkages and non-OECD with non-OECD in backward linkages, we can see that about 25% share is that of China, and India is 1/5 of that. And when we look at the forward linkages of OECD with non-OECD, again of non-OECD with non-OECD, again it is China that is dominating. Then next, we come to the value-added trade accounting framework, which has been adopted by the Asian Development Bank following the Borini and Mancini approach. So here, when the gross exports, they are divided into the domestic value-added, foreign value-added, pure domestic double counting, and domestic value-added is divided into the directly absorbed part by the direct importer, re-exported, and what is reflected back home, and directly absorbed by P, that is the importer, that is divided into what is absorbed by way of final goods and what is absorbed as intermediates. So it is the domestic, it is the DAVEX plus REX that constitutes the value-added exports. And when we look at the GVC related trade, it is not the entire gross exports which is flowing into GVCs, rather it is the one which has been highlighted. So foreign value added, that is the backward participation in GVCs, and REX plus REF is going into the forward GVC participation. And when we look at the definitions that they have given, so from the DVA, DVA, what is absorbed directly by the importer, that is the DAVEX, that is not considered in GVC related trade, rather it is REX plus REF plus FBA plus PDC, and the total GVC participation rate is referring to the indirect trade in gross exports, that is what is the portion of exports whose underlying value added crosses 2 or more borders before final consumption. And the forward and the backward participation here are also additive. I'm not going to look at the production based approach in my work, so I have just mentioned it here that there is another alternate way in which the GVC participation can be measured, which is in terms of the unfinished exports of domestic value added. And since these two approaches often give different results for different sectors, and since I have not used it, I'm just introducing it here that yes, there is another alternate approach, but we will focus on the export composition using the trade-based approach from the export sector. So when we look at 2018, 2019, 2020, so here we are now moving from the DIVA database to the Asian Development Bank database. So we can see here that because that question also comes that are the two databases comparable? So the GVC participation rate is not too different if we look at the two databases. So for instance, in 2020, we find that India's GVC related trade is 33.4%. The one which has been highlighted in the pink. Traditional trade represents the largest component of trade. Backward participation is the dark gray, and the forward GVC participation is the light brown color. And when we look at the GVC participation as a percentage of gross exports, we find that most of the economies have shown an increase in their GVC participation, though in comparison with China and India, it is economies like Nepal, then Cambodia, and Vietnam that are showing more dynamism. Now, this database that I'm considering is the one which provides the consolidated data for 25 economies. Initially, I started looking at the multi-regional input-output tables, which are provided by the ADB, which have more economies apart from the ones in Asia Pacific. But I found that when this 25 economy database came up, there was slight difference in the numbers which were coming up. And since the ADB database, the consolidated one, is providing other indicators also, so I thought it is better to move to the one which is the consolidated one for these 25 economies, so that the other indicators which they are providing can also be used. Then when we look at the distributional gains, Rashmi has given us information for the year 2009, in which the OECD economies were the beneficiaries of 67% gains, and the rest of the world, which consists of the least developed economies, just got 8% gains. And the power asymmetry, the skewedness has been highlighted in various studies, including Roy. And of late, the factory-less production, in which few lead firms like Apple or Nike, they are the ones who are subcontracting, or who are engaged in foreign contract manufacturers, who are exporting services which are related to intangibles through the tangibles which are produced in other countries. So they are the major beneficiaries of the participation in global value chains. And the smile curve in GVCs shows that it is mainly the pre-manufacturing and the post-manufacturing stages which have more value capture. But of late, when we look at the digital economy, then I have come across a recent study by Thun et al., which are referring to massively modular decentralized systems, in which it is mentioned that that more and more decentralized systems are going to be coming up in case of the electronics sector, especially in comparison to our traditional orientation, that there are going to be some lead firms and then there are going to be some suppliers of tier 1, tier 2, and so on. And coming back to the asymmetry, we find that this asymmetry seems to have exacerbated over time with the deepening of the smile. That is, a lower share of profits is available to the developing economies. And it is not just the developing economies, rather within the developing economies, depending on the skill level, the gains are going to vary. So India has obtained 2% share of the gains, which has risen from 0.6 to 2, whereas China has moved from 3% to 9% over the years. And as we can see over here, in the total gains in GVC participation, by 2018, 63% of the gains were still going to the OECD. So coming a decade after Rashmi's work, we find that the asymmetry continues to exist. The next two slides are on the forward participation and the backward participation. So again, since the picture is more or less the same here, only in case of USA, we find that 12% gains in forward linkages and 4% gains in backward linkages, but India's share is more or less the same. So I move to the slide which shows the ratio of forward to backward participation. So overall, the net gains that India is getting are less than 1 compared to China's more than 1 and USA's 2.7. So as I said in the very beginning, that this paper is highly motivated by the need that we felt to upgrade what Rashmi had done previously. So several of the definitions or several of the aspects you will find are very close to what she has done for the year 2009. Now, when we look at the dominance of China, so here we find that whether we look at labor-intensive sector, we look at medium to high technology sector, we look at total manufacturing, or we look at the total for all the sectors, we find that in the OECD, it is basically, for instance, when we look at Italy, we find that most of the backward participation is coming from the OECD, and China has a much higher share compared with that of India. And similar is the case for India. That is, the dominance of China is showing in all of these aspects. Then when we look at the role of services, we find that services have been considered in the upgradation literature in sustaining firms GVC participation, and we find that the services value added content has been rising over the years. So not only in total, but also in total manufacturers. And the right-hand side graphs, they are showing the domestic and foreign sectoral value added in the global situation as well as for India. So we find that the domestic value added, which is being contributed by the primary and the manufacturing sector, is coming down. That of services is rising, and within that of foreign services is rising. So this is referred to as the servicification of manufacturing, especially. I'll come to the next slide for that. And this is the increasing reliance of manufacturing firms on services, both in-house and outsourcing. And this is the slide which shows that the services content, that is a percentage, the right-hand side one, which shows that the percentage of total manufacturers' gross exports is rising, is high. Rise already we have seen in the previous slide, which was comparing India with 2008 and 2009. And when we look at the domestic and for the left-hand graph, the domestic and foreign sectoral value added of India in comparison with that of other economies, we find that the share of services is relatively high in India when we look at the total gross exports, but in manufacturing gross exports, it is less than that of several other developing economies as well. Then we look at the foreign value added contribution to gross exports. So we find that by and large, as again it was mentioned previously, that foreign value added has bypassed the low technology manufacturing. We find that the share of India also is less than 25 in the foreign value added, which is going to this sector. China has a much larger share, which is going to manufacturing, though it is more in the medium to high technology manufacturing. But across economies, we can see that low technology manufacturing has not been the beneficiary. I'll just take 5 minutes more. That is okay, Rajesh?
Yeah, fine.
Okay. When we look at the sectoral breakup, 35 sectors in the Asian Development Database, we find that electricity, because the rest of the sectors are, I think, clear enough. But electricity, gas, and water supply comes in low technology manufacturing, as does construction. But construction in the TIWA database, it says total services including construction. So it is not considered in the manufacturing sector. So that is why I have considered construction and services rather than including it in the manufacturing sector. Now here we are looking at the total GVC participation, the left one for agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and utilities, and the one on the right for construction and services. So we find that in most of the sectors, GVC participation had increased in 2010. And in 2018 also, several sectors are showing an increase. But after 2018, there has been a decline associated with the pandemic and various geopolitical trade-related disturbances world over. Then next we look at the forward and backward GVC participation rate across sectors. So as you can see that there is a lot of heterogeneity amongst sectors. I have arranged the sectors according to the share of the foreign value of the forward participation. So here we can see sectors such as chemicals, mining, agriculture, and so in the decreasing order, you can see the share of the forward participation, and backward participation is much higher in metals and in refined fuels. Then next is we look at what has been the change from 2010 to 2018. So some sectors have expanded in their forward participation, some have expanded in both, some are getting more backward oriented. So this shows the way in which the sectors have moved over time. Then when we look at the net gains from participation, comparing 2010 with 2018, we find that the net participation gains are not positive for a large number of manufacturing sectors in India, but for few business sectors. Whereas when we look at China, the net value-added gains are positive. Yes, electronics appears to be a question mark, though the share has the net value-added has risen, gains have risen, but still we find that China is not having a net value-added gain that is positive. So this could be associated with the backward participation that China has about 25%. And even in 2000, because this was a sector which I was also not able to understand that way. So I looked at Rashmi's work again for 2009. And in 2009 also, this is a sector which is not showing net value-added gains. And Vietnam, though it has been considered to some extent as an economy that has shown much higher GVC linkages compared with the rest of Asia, yet we find that the net value-added gains in manufacturing are not positive, not coming out to be positive. Then now we look at, if we look at the Asia Pacific region and we look at the forward participation from the sector and the backward participation, that is in terms of the content, the sector which is coming to dominate the others is electricals, followed by metals, chemicals, transport, machinery, and by economy, China is an outlier. But when we look at India's share, then India is not amongst the 23rd or the 24th economy. Rather, it is in the 5th or in the 6th relative position. So this, just gives us some hope that India can become an important player in the regional value chains. Now, here we are looking at the overall participation, primary sector, low technology manufacturing, medium to high technology manufacturing, business services, and personal and public services. So we find that India's overall participation has become more backward oriented, while in the primary sector, there is a forward slant. In low technology manufacturing, there is near synergy between the two rates, but there is very little movement. In backward medium tech, high technology, backward participation has risen. Business services, backward participation has risen more. And in personal and public services, though it appears that a lot of movement is there, but when we look at the scale, then it is relatively less aligned with GVCs as compared to the other sectors. Then when we look at the forward and the backward content, we've again, just the same exercise that we had done for the overall sectors, we have now done for each individual sector. So we again find that though China is much ahead of the other economies in almost all sectors, whether it is low technology or it is high technology, still still India, which is the one in red, is coming as the 4th or the 5th position. And why I have shown both 2018 and 2020 was because we know that the situation has changed between the 2 years. And so I thought it is better to show both the years so that one can just see what has happened between these 2 years, between these years also. Next, coming to the real comparative advantage. Traditionally, we have been looking at the revealed comparative advantage that is based on gross exports, but the ADB database and the papers which are based on it are suggesting that we should rather look at the revealed comparative advantage based on value-added exports, that is excluding the foreign value-added component. So the bars are showing the revealed comparative advantage, and the dots at the hello circle, this is showing the traditional comparative advantage. So we can see that some reordering is observed. For instance, in agriculture and in utilities, the competitive disadvantage is reversed under NRCA. In low technology manufacturing, near stability is observed. We find comparative advantage in textiles and leather, while the competitive advantage in minerals and manufacturing is reversed under NRCA. In medium to high technology, both the indicators are suggesting a comparative advantage in refined fuels, chemicals and metals. Telecommunication, air transport, they show comparative advantage under both For sectors such as education, finance, and retail trade, a comparative disadvantage under conventional trade is reversed, and vice versa for construction, hotels, etc. So it is suggested that there are hidden portions of specialization that are useful to uncover for a more comprehensive analysis of the positioning of firms, sectors, or economies within GVCs. We have already seen that though we are presenting the revealed comparative advantage at the sector level, yet it is within sectors that the specialization is going to lie. And when we look at, this is I think going to be the last slide for the graphs. When we look at the revealed comparative advantage, the ones on the right, that is, ones on the right of one, for instance, textiles, leather. Now, these are the sectors which are having comparative advantage, but our GVC participation is less. Similarly, we can see in the case of services. And when we look at the comparison of light manufacturing with heavy manufacturing, we see that out of 25 economies, though our revealed comparative advantage position, like 7th and 12th in light manufacturing, or when we look at the heavy manufacturing, it is 9th and 11th. It is not as bad, but when we look at the forward participation, it is needs it can be improved much. And then when we look at the summary of what we were able to capture from the data, is that India's GVC participation is not as high as that of several economies, and China continues to be the epicenter. The gains are mainly accruing to the OECD. India's relative gains have increased, the small relative gains have increased marginally. Then where is the difference lying? In the gainers. In USA, we find that whether it is a low technology or it is a high technology sector, most of the gross exports are coming from domestic value added vis-a-vis Vietnam. And India's overall net participation gains were negative except in some sectors. And even as late as 2018, foreign value added is bypassing the low technology manufacturing sectors. For India, we can see that the greater forward leaning is suggesting that the increasing share of the gains can go towards farmers and food product makers with innovative policies that favor upgradation. In low technology manufacturing, despite the potential for raw material and labor absorption and possibilities for SME integration, we have a lot of ground to cover. And as we will see later, that as the as IR 4.0 is throwing up various challenges, we can't just say that it is the low wage advantage that is going to be sufficient for us. In medium to high technology manufacturing, we find that though the backward linkages are higher and they could represent the new and improved imported inputs, yet India's despite the participation, our net value added gains are not positive, and business services are suggesting that the forward participation throws up the need to raise competitiveness in all sectors apart from those which have been dominating in services offshoring. And personal and public services also suggest the potential to capture the gains through upskilling. At the regional level, we find that India's dynamism is reflected as it is amongst the top 6 to 7 economies. The potential for regionalization is there because India is the fourth largest manufacturer fourth largest in manufacturing value added. It accounts for a lot of trade with Asia, and it is a top destination for Asia for FDI by project numbers. And Kumar and George have shown that the South Asia region, despite the ability to become a trade hub and promote broader integration, it is often characterized as the least integrated due to trade barriers that discourage the formation of regional value chains, and boosting and diversifying regional production that remain undeveloped except in few sectors through mutual recognition of standards can assist. And this is going to be more important given the trend towards reshoring and regionalization. Regional new revealed comparative advantage, I have already mentioned previously that based on the revealed comparative advantage, it is possible to increase GVC participation in sectors which are near the threshold of 1, and Nagesh Kumar sir in Khan 2023 has, he has argued for the case that there should be an India-specific model based on India's natural advantage. As we can see that it is not just the sectors, but it is also some it could be specific tasks also, like electronics assembly. And last, we can say that just one more slide, that though several initiatives have been taken in terms of manufacturing-led development, yet the challenges which are going to come in terms of the automation will need several key enablers. And though the importance of services has been highlighted, Amita Batra has highlighted the need for emphasis on goods and services, comprehensive FTAs. Karishma is already there, so I think she will herself be able to tell more about digital technologies and product upgrading, and the need for integrating small and medium enterprises, maybe not micro, but small and medium enterprises that require that enterprises be competitive and more connected. And for trade policy, now I personally feel that I am not in a very good position to comment, because there are various studies and which are coming up with different conclusions regarding tariffs and non-tariffs. But what I feel is the dominant view which is coming in the studies that I have gone through is that we know that India's tariffs are much higher than that of other economies in the sub-region. So there is going to be a cascading effect in the value chain, especially when services are embedded, and there is need to reduce trade policy uncertainty, given that there is a reallocation of FDI for capturing value, inclusiveness, and supply chain resilience. It will be critical to build skills and competency. The quality of FDI has already been emphasized, that we just don't need just FDI, we need the FDI which will go in our export sectors. And we need also to focus on environmental upgrading, because this is one area which will become important in the future, that where the MNCs are going to locate will depend on the energy and the green technology which various economies are able to offer. And last point is that to benefit from GVCs, it is important to increase the absorptive capacity of domestic firms and strengthen their linkages with the non-export sectors, especially given the risks which have come up due to geopolitical and pandemic-induced risks. So thank you very much. I have just tried to rush through.
No, it's okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Isha, for
yeah, I just stopped the screen sharing. Is it okay?
Yeah.
It's gone?
Yeah, it's now. So okay. Thank you, Isha, for a very insightful.
Actually, to be very honest, this is the first exercise in a descriptive statistics analysis. I was very uncomfortable because I'm used to more of firm level data, but this is what.
No, but I'm sure the panelists will have very some good insights on.
Yeah, they will be able to.
So you'll have
help the discussion move forward with their insights.
Yeah. So I now invite the panelists to share their insights, their views, comments. Maybe like 5-7 minutes, if it is okay for you. So I invite Dr. Bhushan Pradeep. So, thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon and good evening to all the members present, and I thank ISID for providing this platform, and I also compliment Isha for presenting such a complex subject within a span of time. I understand the difficulties. I have, since the nature of paper is more like work in progress, so I would like to offer a few suggestions from my own experiences also, just to enrich the paper. And the first comment which I would like to bring in, or the suggestion which I would like to bring in, is that I see that from the beginning of your paper, you have considered GBC trade-related measures by decomposing the gross exports. But I think if you see the recent paper by Borin and others, 2021, they have come up with new measures known as output-related measures. So basically, the difference between the measures of trade and output is that the output measures consider the indirect linkages also. To put in simple words, let's say a company A or the firm A is participating in this GVC related trade, and whereas firm B is not directly participating in the GVC related trade, but is indirectly participating in the GVC related trade through firm A. So somewhere these linkages are missing out in the existing measures. So that is why I think if we can consider this output related measures, the GVC trade which we have might be even more. The magnitude might be even more. And also when the magnitude is more, definitely it's intuitive that the risks are also more. So I think we need to be cautious about that and need to evaluate those things. So that is the first suggestion which I would like to point out. And in the same paper also, I think they have also come up with a new methodology to calculate the complex global value chain participation, which are also known by two-sided integration. So I think you can look into these aspects also, and you can bring in where do we really stand, and where does our sectors, stand in this whole exercise. And secondly, if you see that many of the sectors, if you compare within our India or with other countries, certain sectors might have same percentage of GVC participation. Let's say India has on an average, let's say 34% of GVC participation. And let's say some other country also has the same percentage, 34. That doesn't mean that both these GVC integrations are same. So you need to look at some other factors like the length of sourcing, right? The activities they participate in. So I think simultaneously bringing all this linkages into place might give you a even broader story. Okay. And if you see that sectorally also, you have brought in this discussion of technology intensive sectors and where is the stand that India has. But of course, if you dig deeper, we see that India, most of the GVC participation is in low technology or to maximum medium technology intensive industries. And why is that? I think that's a big question which we need to answer. Is it because that we do not have absorption capacity, or does our macroeconomic framework or the environment doesn't support it? So I think if you can bring in these aspects, it would add more value to the debate which we are looking at. I think some recent papers have also come up as to what should be the actual GVC participation, because that's also important. And I think recently when I've interacted with some of the policymakers, they were like, give us a list on which industries, what activities should we participate in, because that is a complex question which we as an academicians need to come up with this exercise. Because it's very difficult, I understand, but for a policymaker, it's important to target certain activities broadly and also to facilitate certain policy measures so that this can be taken forward. And also the literature recently has started on the threshold effects. I think that's also an important thing which we all can look at. Of course, though some of the suggestions which I'm pointing out might not be really connecting to the paper which you have presented, but more or less I'm trying to convey certain points to a bigger picture. And also, I think in your paper you have commented at several places that we are participating more at the backward linkages than the forward. And also certain papers have also pointed out that the ratio of forward linkages should be greater than the backward. I differ at this point because me with Professor Badrinarayan Rath have worked on several exercises, and we have seen that backward linkages have improve the technological absorption capacity. There are many spillovers associated with that. I think that is where we need to take little caution when we say that we are more at a backward integration than the forward. And also, this is a very timely research because especially after the post-COVID, people who work on this global value chain related aspects or not, everyone have witnessed that there has been disruption in the global value chains. Right? And after this COVID, there has been emphasis on two things. One is regional value chains. And second thing is sustainability of this value chains. So I think if you can bring in these aspects also, it would be even more, value addition to the readers. And if you see post-COVID, it's not only based on the competitiveness of a sector or a country in terms of delivering certain goods, but it's more of patterns like friendshoring based on the agreements we have, the friendly relations we have, which is known by friendshoring or nearshoring. So I think if you can bring in these aspects also, I think that will be even more beautiful. And lastly, I would like to say that if you would like to offer suggestions, what would be it? I mean, whether should we go for certain activities like downstream activities or upstream activities? What is the sector we should focus on? What should India be known for? Let's say Vietnam is known for labor-intensive activities, or Bangladesh is known for textile value chains. So what should be India known for? What should be our policy stance? So if we can arrive at through all this complex data, if we can mine those data and come up with a specific points as in what should be India known for, I think that would be an important great. So I'll stop here because of course there are several points which I would like to say, but the paper is too lengthy, and if I keep on talking, I think it will keep on extending. I would like to stop here, and once again my compliments to the authors, and I also look forward to the final paper. Right? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhushan, for your very insightful comments for the betterment of the paper. This is in working paper. This will soon be in a ISID working paper. So I hope she will incorporate most of the comments. So I now invite Dr. Karishma for her comments on the paper.
Hi everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Isha for that very interesting presentation on looking at what's happening with global value chain participation of India. And I think it was a very comprehensive analysis using some very rich indicators that the Asian Development Bank has constructed, and there's also present in TIVA. And especially like the use of the multiple data sets to kind of understand what's happening over time. And also an in-depth exploration of what's happening with backward and forward linkages at the sector level. So I think it's a very interesting exercise that brings much value to the discussions that we've been having now. And it's also quite timely, right, with the new foreign trade policy and with lots of debates going on around which sectors India should focus on in terms of its linkages. So I had a couple of questions and then maybe some suggestions, which you can feel free to ignore, but I think, point to the larger picture of what's really important when we talk about value chain. So my first question is around, so I noticed in the paper that there is actually a very significant and consistent decline in the overall GVC participation of business services in India. And to me, that's very interesting because we have focused a lot on business services. So it's interesting to see that telecommunications has been rising in terms of value chain participation, but there is actually a very consistent decline in business services. So I'm wondering if you can shed some light on that from whatever reading you've done as to why we see that happening. And second is, I think, something that already Bhushan picked up on was So we see that, in some sectors where India has comparative advantage, it is not able to link into value chains like textiles and garments. And there are other sectors where India doesn't necessarily have the comparative advantage like electronics, but it is making sort of efforts to kind of develop value chain in those sectors. So to me, the question is, really looking at, and this is a very sector level question, right? So what's really happening as to why India is missing the value chain board? Is it a question of non-strategic trade liberalization? Is it a question of incoherent trade policy, liberalization of FDI? So which exact reforms can really help kind of fix that bottleneck? And it could be, also the standard sort of labor reforms, right? Like there are lots of labor market rigidities in the Indian market. So that would be, I think, interesting to bring forward when you discuss some of these GVC participation rates of India in comparison to other economies. So those are my questions. And I think just a few suggestions. So the first one is that, you can see very clearly from your data that India kind of follows these global trends in value chain participation also. So you see a dip after 2012, which is basically the global slowdown in trade, right? As a result of automation, rise of manufacturing wages, and so on. And then you see this increase post 2015. So I think it would be very interesting to bring out some of these points that it is actually mirroring what's happening in the global economy. So, just kind of linking in those big debates around decoupling, around slowdown in manufacturing. The second point is around, I think TIVA has, and also ADB has a lot of interesting data, right, on the origin of these linkages of backward and forward participation. And we see that there's, the literature now shows that there is a significant rise of the polycentric trade pattern, which is basically like the southern economies are trading with each other. So there's a rise in GVC trade of southern countries with southern end markets. And I think some of my work a couple of years ago also showed that India's GVC trade is, in both manufacturing and services, is actually moving away from European countries, from Germany, and it's actually moving towards China. So to me, that's a very interesting shift that you see in terms of geographies of India's GVC trade. And I'd love to find out that what that really means in terms of sophistication of India's GVC participation, right? So the products it's exporting and how sophisticated they are because of this shift that you see gradually happening. Linked to that, I think you also mentioned at some point that, you see a lot of dynamic changes in Vietnam in terms of the fact that it's able to increase its GVC participation. And there's actually a big gap, and significant improvement in Vietnam. And I think the story boils down there to the traditional measures around export diversification. So if you look at Vietnam's data, it has actually introduced lots of new products in a very short span of time, and it has gone from like a garments manufacturer to electronics manufacturer, right? So I think those traditional measures around export diversification should be analyzed in conjunction with the GVC measures to really understand what's happening and what lessons can be learned from countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam in terms of enhancing participation. Then I think I really like the analysis around servicification of manufacturing, overall exports and also manufacturing exports. I think that is quite critical, and particularly when we look at the rise of digital services, digital economy, you see that a lot of these digital services, what's going into the manufacturing sector. But not necessarily, I don't think necessarily servicification of manufacturing shows rise in value addition, because there's a lot of literature around structural transformation that is also showing that a lot of these structurally underdeveloped economies are actually moving towards non-traditional services, right? So not the business services, but the lower value-added services. And I think, so this is what the point I was trying to raise earlier was around, we see that India's GVC participation in business services is actually falling. So to me, it's interesting to dig a bit more deep into what's really happening when we talk about servicification of manufacturing exports in India, and what sort of services are we really talking about here? And that could also have very interesting policy reforms. And I think, my last point is around looking at rise of, like you mentioned, India can act as a manufacturing sort of growth pole in the region and, regional value chains. It would be interesting to combine this with data on outward FDI that I think, you've obviously done a lot of work on FDI. to really look at the rise of lead firms in India, because India is also starting to form its own value chains, like, with Tata and, a lot of these lead firms, Mahindra and Mahindra. So it's interesting to look at the rise of lead firms in India and its potential to form value chains, and in which sectors can it really emerge as the sort of superstar in terms of really climbing up that smile curve and, specializing in services or value addition or branding or designing. So which sectors those can be identified using the data. So yeah, I think overall, I think it's a very interesting study, and these are just some suggestions to perhaps improve the analysis a bit more and to look a bit more in depth. So yeah, hope that's useful.
Thank you.
Rishma, for your very critical comments for the betterment of the paper. So I now invite Dr. Satyaki Roy for his insights on the paper.
Thank you, Rajesh, and thanks to Isha for this exhaustive work on India's position in global production network. And I would basically say that some of these observations can be highlighted, made more prominent in the paper when you finalize that. Sometimes they are actually hidden and not coming out prominently in this exhaustive exercise. I will focus on two very important observations, which is not, of course, typical about India, but your work shows that it is also true in case of India. Now, one is the declining domestic value added in gross exports. Now, this is not a trend which is very much typical about India. Most of the developing countries, even many of the advanced countries, they face similar trend. And I would say that there is not much to worry about, in the sense that the decline in domestic value added in gross exports is happening with a similar trend, or what we can say is accompanied by a trend where the share of gross exports in the GDP of the respective countries is increasing. So the share of exports in GDPs of respective countries are increasing, but the share of domestic value added in gross exports is declining. And this is basically because of the interpenetrative nature of today's production network, where countries are becoming more and more interdependent upon each other, which is being reflected in global production network. But what I would say that when you are coming to the question of participation and measuring the gain, as has been discussed earlier and pointed out by previous speakers, that when we talk about this backward linkage, which is basically the foreign value added in a country's exports, which in a sense manifests the dependence of a country in the production structure of to other countries. And one can be more dependent, but at the same time, his contribution or that country's contribution in foreign exports may increase because of that also. So the question of net gain becomes important. And foreign value added or forward linkage, one can say, is the domestic value added in foreign exports, as has been defined in GPN literature. And as you said, that in case of India, it is less than 1, the foreign forward linkage by backward linkage. I would say that what Dr. Bhushan has raised is, I agree to that, but to some extent, I also differ to that, in the sense that, of course, extension of the backward linkage gives certain countries to acquire more technologies, or technology absorption may increase. But when we are talking in terms of global production network, your position should not be measured only in absolute terms. It should be measured in relative terms. So if in a particular industry, the average technology increases faster than the technology absorption that is happening in your country through backward linkage, even if your productivity is increasing, you may lose out in terms of share in value added. And that is happening in most of the developing countries. So this is, of course, important. And I would say that this is not something which is a mere coincidence, that most of the advanced economies, their share of participation lies more in the forward linkage, and most of the developing countries, their share of participation lies in the backward linkage. There is a definite pattern, and I believe that this is structural. Why I'm saying this, and I would focus more on this issue, because I would not agree to this view that just if you increase your productivity and try to upgrade in the global production network, you can increase your share of value added in the GP and value produced. Because what is happening that even if you increase your productivity, how the goods and services or the tasks which are being produced by the developing countries, how they're valued, that is also very important. And there are a lot of literature which tries to say that there is a structural unequal exchange. There is an undervaluation of the goods and services produced by developing countries and an overvaluation of the goods and services produced by advanced economies. And I would refer to 4 perspectives which would help to analyze this, and you can push this argument a little bit further, and you can analyze your data on the basis of that. One is the Lewisian transformation when it is discussed in the international context. But Lewis argued long back that developing countries where you have labor surplus, the wages are linked to subsistence wage, and in advanced economies, wages are linked to marginal value product of labor. So when these 2 countries enter into a trade, if productivity increases in advanced economies, it is being reflected through higher wages. In developing countries, since you have labor surplus, if productivity increases, it may not be reflected in higher wages, rather it may be reflected in terms of declining terms of trade. So even if you participate more, your terms of trade, and this ratio between forward and backward linkage is nothing but a different version of the terms of trade which you used to talk about earlier. And this moves against the developing countries. The similar kind of argument, but in a different way, was put forward by Pravish Singer, which says that it is because of the differential in the profit rate in industries located in advanced economies and developing countries. Because developing countries, they export mainly primary products where the market is competitive. And in case of advanced economies, it is a monopolistic structure. So the profit rates are different. And in the longer run, the terms of trade moves in favor of the advanced economies. And Kaplinsky, in the context of modern global production network, has argued and empirically shown that even if the exports of light engineering and manufacturing has increased from advanced economies, but if you see the terms of trade between light engineering export by economies and imports of high technology manufacturing goods from advanced economies, the terms of trade once again have moved against the developing economies. The third perspective, which may be useful to analyze this issue of net gain, is Penn effect, which has also been argued and been discussed, that there is a systematic discrepancy between the valuation of the goods and services produced in terms of current exchange rate with respect to the valuation done in PPP terms in their respective domestic currencies. And this is what is usually called exchange rate deviation index, which one can derive from Penn effect. And many literature has come out to measure this. And the last point, which I would say, that you can also analyze this decline and the net gain becoming actually reducing even if your participation increases, because of the differential in terms of organic composition of capital, which Marx argued long back in Capital Volume 3, that because of the difference in organic composition of capital between two countries, two economies, or two industries even, there is a transfer of value from low organic composition of capital to high organic composition of capital, independent of if these 2 countries or these 2 industries are actually differentiated by national borders or not. So it is not about only international trade. This differential in organic composition of capital actually creates a transfer of value from low OCC to high OCC. So all this actually tells us about the fact that it is not only the increase in productivity. I would focus finally on 2 points. One is when you are talking about regional trade, of course, upgradation and technology increase and productivity upgradation is important. And we can easily upgrade and increase our share in global value chain, our share in value added, by by participating in high value added activities, and also by protecting the rents institutionally, which are created in different nodes. Because ultimately in GPN literature, the value added is nothing but the rents that has been created by privileged access of certain resources or some knowledge or some organization. So that rent has to be protected institutionally. So this is one way when we are talking about competition between countries in the same region. But when we're talking about North and South, between advanced and developing countries, as I mentioned, that we should bring in this structural problem. I will finally cite one study, which is being Milberg and Winkler. And the study was looking into 30 developing countries for 3 decades. And it basically tried to analyze the prospect of upgradation of these countries. And the conclusion was that he took 3 measures. One is strong absolute upgradation is considered when the productivity growth is faster than the growth of exports. You term it as strong absolute upgradation. Weak absolute upgradation is basically when the productivity is growing, but it is growing at a lesser pace than the growth of exports. And finally, when there is no productivity growth. Out of these 30 countries for 3 decades, the result shows that only 9 of these countries, developing countries, could show weak absolute upgradation. None of them actually show strong absolute upgradation. So my point is that we should bring in this structural asymmetry while analyzing the distribution of gains across the value chain. I stop here.
Thank you, Satagi, for your very critical and alternative approach. So I now invite Dr. Isha to respond to the very wonderful insights that these panelists have raised. So over to you, Isha. We can have open the discussion from the audience after this. So let's have a detailed discussion later. Yeah.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you, all the panelists. I am overwhelmed by the comments and the questions and the remarks. So I will just try to do what is possible for me right now. The suggestions which have been given by Professor Praveen on looking at the output related measures, that is certainly something which really is requisite, and I will definitely try to look at that aspect also. And when you have mentioned that we can look at where India stands in upstreamness or downstreamness, so that is in which sector. So the ADB database itself is providing the sector-wise indicator for upstreamness and downstreamness. So I had started looking at that also, but since this was becoming just too much data to handle and put in one paper, so I have not explored that issue here. But I think without the data, without going through the sectoral indicators for upstreamness, it would not be right to comment on where India should participate in upstreamness or downstreamness, but I will look up that literature also. And when you mentioned very rightly about the friendshoring aspect, so again in the database there is an indicator for agglomeration, which is looking at the reshoring aspect. So I have considered that also, but again not included here. Again for the very same reason, but I take your points, and because honestly all of these points will take me a lot of time to absorb and to bring up maybe in an alternate paper in more detail. Then thank you, Karishma, so much for your insights. And honestly speaking, I am not so much into services, because what all I had been doing in my previous work also was more or less related to manufacturing. I was slightly uncomfortable with, bringing in the services GVC participation also. But then when I looked at the data, and when you look at the linkages of the services sector with the manufacturing, I thought it is just not right to say that we will not look at the services, linkages at all, especially in utilities also, because earlier I was thinking that should I put the utilities indicator for utilities also or not. But then I read some papers, and I am in the process of reading some papers on services, and maybe I can get back to you on this in more detail later on, because in each sector, I think it is like a different story, because that is the problem also which I was having in this paper, in the sense that all the sectors are there, 35 sectors are there, and it is just it was not just possible to go into the depth of each sector that ways. But still, since you have mentioned the other thing that we mentioned is about the trade policy. So here again, in a internal presentation, I had looked up some aspects of the tariff rates, and again I have not presented over here, but GVC policy related to trade, to FDI, is again work in progress. So I can again comment better on that, but I have been looking at these aspects as I understand the signal that you are giving, because these are the aspects which are going to be of more prominence after the description of a sector that we have. So I take both your comments, both your questions that way as comments here, and again I will look in the detail. And Sir Satyaki sir, honestly speaking, this is what shall I say? This will take me a lot of time to absorb the literature that you have mentioned, because I am not familiar with the literature that you have mentioned, apart from what we have done in trade, and when I can nod my head and say, yes, I understand the terms of trade aspect. But apart from that, I will need to go back. Maybe it's an entirely different paper which you have suggested, and with your in-depth, I don't know from where it has come. I mean, how much would have gone into, how much thought has gone into it, and how much reading has gone into it. I am really a novice, I would say. Beyond that, I cannot say anything more. This is my humble submission to all of you at the moment. But I will definitely be looking up this area, since it's the first exercise, and I could probably capture only this much in this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Isha. Thank you. I know this is it's a very complex subject, and it's a refinement of the trade itself, theory itself. So it takes a lot to understand the dynamics of GVC and all.
And then two databases were there, so I was having a difficulty in aligning the two also. It took me some long time to understand how to deal with forward participation at the sectoral level with TIVA database. I tried some researches also, but I could not get through. Then I looked at a kind of mechanical approach, which is to present what data is with you. That is.
Okay, so now I think we can open the floor for questions and comments from the audience, online participants. If anybody wants to ask some questions to either the presenter or the panelist, you can raise your hand or unmute and ask questions. Any question in the chat box? No. Professor Golder is here. Sir, are you here? I can see his name. Do you want to comment some? No. Yes, sir.
Hello. I thought I'll keep quiet because people who have done a lot of research, but since my name has been taken, I have to say something. So Isha, one point I have is, one of the commentators had said that it would be useful to give some policy direction into which area, which activity, which industry. Obviously, your data cannot answer that, because all these international data work with only 25 sectors, 30 sectors. But to give answer to the government, you need 1,000 sectors. But it can be done for the country, because for India, you can build such as IO. And it may be useful to really build a much an IO table for India with a much larger number of sectors, where steel is not one industry, but divided into 3 parts or what. So that you can then, similarly, pharma is divided into 2 parts, 3 parts. And then you will be able to answer this kind of questions. But there is a more basic issue. Should we try to give some this sort of answers that we need to promote industry X or industry Y? Is that the right thing to do? Or does the government or the scholars really know? Or should the market drive that? Because when people may start thinking that we know better than the market and we should drive the industries, which one is good and which are not good. Apart from that, this is one thing I had in. The second thing I had in mind is, now you talk of the smile curve and you say that generally India tends to be not in the leftmost portion or the rightmost portion, but somewhere in the middle, so that value-added portions low. But just a thought, if we think each value chain is being driven by some company, then there is some sort of a bargaining happening with everybody in the value chain. Who will get how much? Ultimately, X dollars is coming from a product being sold in US. Out of that X products, different people have to get. So this is a bargaining problem. So why is it that we are in a bad side of the bargaining problem? And that we must always get low amount. Now you can say this is a conspiracy. I don't think it's a conspiracy. This is a bargaining power, because if I don't do it, somebody else will do it with a lower cost. So I really don't have the bargaining power. But if there are certain activities where I have some sort of monopoly power, I can bargain. Similarly, even the common tasks, which you are saying very common, but if you have so much of proficiency and so much of technological knowledge that you can do much better than others, then you will have a bargaining position. So I think this smiley curve is fine, but there is an issue of bargaining in this. So it may be possible to get a better bargain than others. I mean, this is not for you, not for this paper, just generally about this smiley. And there is also an issue here, which also comes to my mind. If through better technology, I'm able to get a better bargain for the task I do, to look as if I am becoming more productive. So so there is a bit of a confusion. Is it a better bargaining I'm getting? Or it is I am becoming more productive? Is my productivity going up or my bargaining power going up? There is a possibility of doing this research. I have thought about this. Of course, I have not been able to do it, but maybe somebody will pick it up in that. I'll stop after this. Just one last point. In the different lines of production, are there some products where we are closer to the end point of the chain? We have been able to reach. Maybe we are going right up to the marketing stage, or we're going right from the product design stage. Are there some products where we are not able to do so? Why? Why is it that in pharma, we are right from the beginning of the curve to the end of the curve? But in some other products, we are not there. So this can be one line of analysis, trying to find out why. Maybe if there is OFDI, then we may be able to go right up to the marketing stage. Or maybe we are able to get much better bargain for ourselves. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Any other from the audience wants to ask some question or? Isha, you want to respond to Golda sir?
I am very thankful to sir for joining. He has been in almost all my presentations. When he said yesterday, I will be in your presentation, somehow I wanted to just run and hide somewhere, but I'm so happy he has come and he has given some insights, which will be, I think, with all of us, because the insights that he has given are not just for me. I think we will all benefit greatly from them. And last but not the least, I would like to thank Nagesh sir, who is the co-author for this paper, because it has been his guidance throughout the questions that he has asked me, which I did not have answers for. And then, it just started moving from one section to the other. But all the insights which I have, I think it will take me a lot of time to bring out something also, because they are very deep thoughts coming from all of you have been working in this literature for much longer than myself, and have greatly contributed to today's. I was very, very nervous, I would say, coming here, but I think that apart from me, everybody has benefited from the insights that you all have provided. So thank you very much for that. Thank you so much, Rajesh. Thank you all.
Thank you, Isha, and thank you the panelists for their wonderful insights on the critical comments as well of a very, very significant issue. So, sir, you want to say something? Satyaki sir?
No. Thank you. No.
So, because there are no other questions from the audience, I think we are also on time. So, I thank everyone. Thank you, Isha. Thank you, Bhushan. Thank you, Karishma. And thank you, Satyaki sir, for this wonderful seminar on India's participation in GBC. So, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.